My name is Adam Kerr. I work with Kimley Horn and Associates here in West Palm Beach, and I'll be the moderator for this session. To my right are, and who I will qualify in more detail in a minute here, Fred Schwartz, also with Kimley Horn, Kim Briesmeister, who is the director of the City of West Palm Beach CRA, and Wade Walker with Fuss & O'Neill. Just a few housekeeping reminders. Everyone needs to remember that this one has been approved for AIA and AICP credit. So for the AIA attendees, there should be a sign-in sheet at the back of the room to write your name and your AIA number on that clearly. And then also for the AICP attendees, just go online and report your attendance at that. It's 1.25 credits for AIA and 1.25 for AICP. This session is called Realizing Streets for Everyone and Getting Someone Else to Pay for Them, Funding, Designing, and Implementing Complete Streets. And basically, what we're trying to accomplish here with this session is to provide an understanding of the role of complete streets in achieving balanced, walkable environments, but then also and presenting examples of those from around the country, successful complete streets that have been implemented, but then also how municipalities are securing the funding and collaborating with funding sources and business owners to make those complete streets a reality. We'll talk about non-traditional funding sources for implementing complete streets, such as Tiger and Sustainable Community Challenge grants. Most of you probably know already, but just as a brief overview of what is a complete street, the basic idea is that a complete street is a street that's designed for all users in that area. So in an urban environment, that would typically be pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and very importantly, the shop owners along that street. They obviously benefit from the interaction on the street. And it's also key to remember that complete streets need to be designed within the context of the community. There's no one specific type of complete street cross-section or look. It's different in every community, certainly different in urban areas versus suburban areas versus rural areas. For example, in a rural area, a complete street wouldn't necessarily have as many pedestrian amenities because it's rural, but you might have maybe some higher speed bike type facilities along a rural road versus an urban area where it would be more pedestrian oriented. And one of the most important concepts of a complete street, again, is that it gives the users the ability to decide which mode of transportation best suits the trip that they're about to take. So here's just a couple, before the panelists give their own examples, here's just a couple examples of some before and after locally complete street projects. This is in Delray Beach, Florida, which is about 20 miles south of here. I don't know if any of you went on the Delray Beach tour. This is Atlantic Avenue many, many years ago. And as you can see, it was very car-oriented. No pedestrians in those shots, and also not a lot of commerce along the roads. This is Atlantic Avenue today. And you can see, as a complete street, you can see the interaction of the pedestrian uses. They're certainly it's more amenable pedestrian environment just because of the shade trees, the separation from the road, but then it also does provide the room for the motorists as well. If anyone took the Clematis tour, or if they've been on Clematis Street here in West Palm Beach this week, this is what Clematis Street used to look like. And again, the same thing. Not many amenities there for non-vehicle uses. This is today. You can actually sit out along Clematis Street. It's that friendly. You can see some tables. There's bike facilities. There's bike racks on the top photo in the far corner there. So these have become complete streets. Our speakers today, Fred Schwartz. Fred's the Senior Vice President at Kimley Horn and Associates in downtown Chicago. He serves as a project manager on a variety of traffic engineering, transportation planning, transit, and redevelopment projects. He was a contributing author to the Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares Context-Sensitive Approach book. And he spent over 25 years here in Florida, most recently in West Palm Beach, where he served as the City of West Palm Beach traffic consultant and led the efforts to reconstruct US 1, Dixie Highway, and Olive Avenue through downtown, which he's going to talk about in more detail today. Fred recently relocated to Chicago in 2008, where his projects include those for CDOT and CTA, including transit-oriented station area planning and typology planning, and then assists other Kimley-Horn projects across the country. Kim Briesmeister is the executive director to the City of West Palm Beach Redevelopment CRA, as well as a consultant principal with Redevelopment Management Associates, RMA, where she oversees $70 million in redevelopment programs, including business development, negotiating public-private deal structures, business recruitment and retention, marketing, residential development, and bond and finance structures. She's not just worked here in Florida, but also spent a significant amount of time leading redevelopment work in the Caribbean, specifically in Curacao. And then Wade Walker is the Director of Transportation at Fuss & O'Neill in Davidson, North Carolina, near Charlotte. And he has a wide range of experience in transportation planning and engineering assignments. For most of his career, Wade has focused in the realm of context-sensitive design and solutions, and he's going to spend a lot of time today explaining some of the funding mechanisms for actually implementing complete streets. Just as a reminder about our format today, each panelist is going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Fred Schwartz.
Adam, thank you. It's great to be here, great to be back in South Florida. I'm going to be talking about great streets in general, but specifically about Dixie Highway and Olive Avenue here in West Palm Beach 10 years later, and go back through a bit of the history of how we got to where we are today. I live in Chicago. This is Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago, and Michigan Avenue is about a block from where we live, and I don't think anybody would argue that this is one of the world's greatest streets. It's easy for all users to use Michigan Avenue. You can see bikes and peds and buses all in the same place. But as Adam said, not all great streets have to look like Michigan Avenue. I did spend 25 years of my career in South Florida, which this photo is much more representative of what you find in South Florida. Palm Beach County calls themselves the golf capital of the galaxy, I guess. I don't know. And you might wonder why I dwell on that, except that I think there is a lesson that we can learn. I call it the golf course theory of street design. What? And it goes like this, that just as great golf courses create residential value to those homes that are adjacent to it, great streets create community value to the context that is adjacent to the streets. And so I think complete streets are about the users, but they're also about adding value, and I think Kim and Wade are going to talk more about that later this afternoon. Before I go too much further, I want to think about and have you think about the politicians and elected officials that have helped our cause. This is City of West Palm Beach Commissioner Bill Moss, who was a great partner during the 10 years of Dixie and Olive, and has fingerprints all over what you see outside the windows here in downtown West Palm, and just died suddenly last month of a heart attack. Now, you could say that he doesn't look like the healthiest guy around, but he certainly was one of the friendliest guys and helpful to West Palm Beach and to the cause of complete streets. So I challenge you to think of who your elected officials are that are maybe similar to Bill in terms of helping us out achieve what we as engineers and planners are trying to do. Bill oversaw what I'll call the decade of construction in West Palm Beach. Literally 10 years of some road in this city being under construction, a bridge or a street, some for years at a time, and it was very disruptive. This is an example, and you know when there's grass and weeds growing in the construction zone that it's been that way for a while. We did provide for pedestrians throughout the construction zone, not very well sometimes. And as I say, it was very disruptive and a lot of uproar and I think political upheaval because of it. It was created in large part by Florida DOT deciding to resurface Dixie Highway and Olive Avenue, as you can see through the city of West Palm Beach. We are located right about in here, near Dixie and Olive, and between Okeechobee and Lakeview, the streets going east and west. And so DOT had programmed in their budget these 8 projects. And back then, the one-way, two-way street configuration was, as you see here, mainly one-way streets, the whole distance of Olive through the city, and a good part of the segment of Dixie. And they were the classic one-way streets, Wade. We may have a debate on one-way streets later, but these were 3-lane, wide, high-speed, one-way streets, and the county was proud of the fact that they had timed all the signals so you could get all the way through downtown West Palm without even noticing. And there wasn't a whole lot to notice anyway, as you can see by the photo. So DOT brought about $30 million to resurface these streets, and the city had some other utility money in as well. But they were going to put them back just the way they were. They weren't going to move any curb lines. They were just going to resurface. And so Mayor Nancy Graham and Ian Lockwood, the city transportation planner at the time, came up with T21, which is the old federal money for what was called Traffic Calming Demonstration Grant. And that $11 million was actually what allowed the reconstruction to go back differently than the streets were before. And so in order to communicate to DOT about what the city wanted, we prepared this master plan book for Dixie Highway and Olive Avenue. And as I said, Ian was very involved in it. Tim Stillings was the transportation planner at the city at the time and very involved in each step along the way of putting this plan together. One of the things we did was reorient the US 1 state highway designation. And it used to follow Dixie and Olive. And so in the downtown area, we were able to redesignate Quadrille as the US 1 designation, which opened up the downtown segments of those streets to city design standards, and they didn't have to abide by the state highway design standards. And we were able to convert many of the one-way streets to two-way. Those in the core of downtown, as you've seen on the ground and on this graphic, remained one-way. That's not what we initially proposed, but I think in hindsight it was probably a good thing, and I'll try to make that case for you in the rest of the presentation. At the gallery reception last night, I noticed this piece of new urbanist art on the wall, and it's a Peter Calthorpe drawing, which came out, as I remember, just about the time we were working on this Dixie Olive project, and it looks at one-way couplets and says that in town centers and in village centers, as you come through with the main streets, he's advocating opening up into a one-way pair for a short distance in a very narrow cross-section with slow speeds and very walkable. And so I'll try to make that case as well throughout the presentation. So the master plan used these techniques to present the ideas of what Dixie and Olive ought to look like. Here is one of the concept plan views, and you'll notice these lines are where the curb lines used to be. So it was basically a 50-foot right-of-way with 40 feet of street, and then little 5-foot ribbons of sidewalk in the outside, as long as there was no utility pole, and then that came out of the 5 feet. And so you see two one-way streets, two one-way lanes, 11 feet wide, parking alternating on one side or the other, and a pretty narrow, tight cross-section. We did do what we called 10% plans, just to work out all the details of right-of-way and sidewalk width in the various blocks, and we created these cross-sections to show, among other things, how the curb and gutters would work. And one of the things I like about this section is this valley gutter in between the parking lane and the through lane, so that curb line, or actually a gutter line, continues and gives you a nice, straight, clean cross-section. And so as these streets were implemented in downtown, we were able to bring that cross-section in tighter, and I maintain that the streets allowed some of this development to happen. Commissioner Kimberly Mitchell this morning said that she came to town just as all the good work was being done in West Palm, and she takes credit for all of it. Well, I'm taking credit for all of it. The streets created the redevelopment potential. And we talked about trying to enclose the cross-section with where the right-of-way narrowed, still bring those buildings up to the sidewalk. And as this shot of Olive shows, we're definitely able to achieve that in many places. And from there came the newest hotel in downtown. We still need lots more, Kim. But I would maintain that the Hyatt Place might not have come if the streets and the rest of the network in downtown hadn't been what it is. It allowed some of the old historic buildings to redo canopies and facades. One of the things that we did was adopt a new curb. Now, this is where we get a little engineering wonky here, but most curbs in Florida are 6-inch tops and 18-inch gutters. And we adopted this 12 and 12, which gives a much heftier curb look, and I think kind of a straighter curb. I think it's easier to construct, and so you'll notice that much wider top to the curb and gutter. We also adopted what's shown here is a raised crosswalk, but also raised intersections to bring the street up to the top of the curb line so that we were allowed to have flush curbs, no curbs at the crosswalk and in the intersection as a whole. And so the intersections ended up looking like this, where the crosswalks and the raised part of the intersection were all very visible and legible, that this was an intersection and a place where you can find pedestrians. So this is Olive and Clematis, and what I love about this is the pedestrians are crossing just like they should. They're crossing that 22-foot narrow cross-section. But what else do you notice? They're crossing against the light. The green light is on Olive, and they're crossing Olive, but it's narrow enough. To me, that's a measure of the walkability of those streets and the low-speed nature of the street, that you can see a car coming from one direction, know that it's safe to cross, and you go ahead and do it. The traffic engineers in the room are getting a little nervous now, I know, but it just works. So this is Dixie, and these streets create great sidewalks and plazas next to the new city hall and library facility, created the bones on which the rest of that could hang. We used these poor man's images, which are just sketching on top of a photo to show how the changes would occur. And at this building, you can see 5-foot sidewalk at best. We talked about some of these shop owners having to look both ways before they open their doors. And then the lines on the photo show how you can bring those curbs in and change the look of that block. And how you can, next to that building, create plazas or areas where city life can happen and the narrower street and parking that can occur. And we amp that up even more to put that into a 3D image to try to communicate to the public the potential of these improvements. And so they went under construction, and as I said, many of these shop owners suffered a lot during this time. But then it actually happened that way. And as you go out and look at this same building on Dixie, you can see the wider sidewalk where you've got cafe tables. Notice the shadow. I'll come back to that. I'm not happy with the photo came out, but there's a great reason for it. And created great streets and sidewalks where you can sit and get hookah'd up, whatever that is, right next to streets that are carrying cars. So we're able to create places. That's the reason for the shadow. So I guess we can't complain that there's significant residential buildings also occurring in this area. Towards the south end of the city, this is the way Olive Avenue used to look. And one of my favorite Ian Lockwood statements is, if you design streets like gun barrels, people will drive like bullets. And that describes this street exactly. They did, until it was redesigned, made two-way. Some of the blocks were bricked, and new townhouses sprung up along them. This was one of Ian's brainstorms, which I think came out pretty good. It's called Pioneer Plaza. And rather than just run this street straight next to this little boulevard that leads down to the lake, he proposed bringing it together in an amoeba-looking roundabout. And this is Pioneer Plaza, I'll say 5 or 7 years ago, shortly after it was constructed. Bollards to delineate the curbless difference between street and sidewalk. This is all horizontal. There's no vertical curb in the plaza. Stone benches and bollards and lighting all the way around the roundabout. Now this photo is taken earlier this week. You notice any differences? There's some teeth missing over here. And I assume that these bollards were modified by out-of-control drivers. And I don't know whether there's a program to replace them or not, but that really is the only difference, I think, over the 10 years or 8 years since it's been built. It's worn very well. Maybe Tim can tell us about the bollards missing, whether he's taken one out or not. This is a little bit farther north on Olive, in the area of Palm Beach Atlantic University, and these college students are all over these intersections, which is a testament to the way they were designed. Again, curbless, crosswalks, very pedestrian-oriented. The new government courthouse was built during this time, probably about late 90s, I guess. And we used one of these poor man's images again to look at how that street could be reconstructed with a median. Notice this building off to the side, fairly close to Dixie Highway. Early American grotesque architecture, I think, is what was used there. But it actually enshrouded the old courthouse. And so at about the same time, early 2000s, I guess, they realized that they wanted to pull the shroud away from the courthouse and unenclose it. And so That was a part of what we proposed here, including a crosswalk, a raised crosswalk to go from the government center to the old courthouse, right on axis with each other, which happened not to be on axis with the existing sidewalk. So it actually didn't happen that way. The crosswalk went down below, off axis. A little bit one of the discouraging things about the project. But this is how it looks today. Slow speeds on narrow lanes next to the courthouse. And the historic courthouse has been wonderfully renewed. Hopefully some of you have seen it since you've been here. And that's all I've got. I think we'll answer questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Like Fred, it's good to get back here. I haven't been here in about 7 years, and really interesting to see the strides that have been made. What I want to relay to you today is a new strategy for implementing Streets for Everyone and show you some examples of where this has been done. I call it the OPM strategy. Everybody is looking for funding, looking for money in the couch cushions per se, and we're becoming very creative about our funding strategies. Just to touch on a few things and follow up on some things that Adam touched on earlier. We've known really how to build great communities for years, including the street network and the public realm. So what happened? Did we just suddenly forget? No, we really just started catering more to the motor vehicle. People forgot how to walk, apparently. We really, as traffic engineers, guilty as charged, we really started to get into much more of an auto-centric transportation philosophy, really worrying about things like throughput, level of service, operational efficiency. What that really led to was prohibition of certain things in our design guidelines, such as, we can't build a road with a speed less than 45 miles an hour. We can't build lanes less than 11 feet wide. In some instances, we can't build two-lane roads that actually have actually run into that. And pedestrians, we don't need facilities for pedestrians. Thank goodness today, through the CNU ITE joint effort, we do have some guidance that now, as engineers, we can lean on for knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all, that urban environments take very much more care to get the right kind of facility in and cater to all modes of transportation. We're not trying to move cars. We're trying to move people, and let's don't forget that. So, like Adam said, our definition of complete streets, you can see this on the National Complete Streets Coalition website. I can tell you what a complete street is not. Right out in front of the convention center, who's tried to walk across Okeechobee? The only thing complete about that street as a pedestrian is it is a complete disaster. So one of the things that we really do start to look toward is an overall transportation strategy where we're literally looking beyond the curbs. We really want to make sure that we balance, we incorporate livability, and complete streets are a way to do that. We want to eliminate gaps between modes so that people can take transit and become a pedestrian. They can put their bike on a bus. They can go somewhere, park, becomes a park once environment, and then they can walk around. One of the most important things that's happened is in the veritable case of cats and dogs sleeping together, us as engineers have started working with architects, planners, urban designers, and really looking at the overall sense of place and how the streets fit within that realm. And we're bringing the community into the kitchen as well. So what really are complete streets when you get down to it? They respect the overall context. We want to make sure that things are connected, not just from a vehicular standpoint, but also across modes. We want to have clearly defined zones and realms and really understand that the street components all exist beyond the travel lane. Been a lot of buzz lately about complete streets policies. I'm happy to report that 25 states plus Puerto Rico and DC have adopted complete streets policies, as well as US DOT now has a federal complete streets policy. That's not the end. Upon adoption of a complete streets policy, we need to be very careful that we move forward immediately into resolving design guidelines issues so we can actually build them. Because we don't want to be like South Carolina and say, hey, we were one of the first states to adopt a complete streets policy, but you really can't build it because everything that you want to do is against our design guidelines. So we just really want to make sure that that is the process that we follow and that we keep pushing with regard to that. Now comes the $800 or $8 million question. Hey, great streets. How do we pay for them? This now gets into the show me the money part of the presentation. What we propose is what we call the OPM funding method. Very simply, OPM stands for other people's money. We want to make sure that we really start to leverage the funding sources that are available, because we know that federal government, the states, state DOTs, they don't have the money to be able to do this kind of thing. So we're looking for bits and pieces and putting it all together to really be able to actualize and realize those visions. We really don't care who it comes from. We'll take it from the public sector, we'll take it from the private sector, and we always understand that once we do these things, what we're trying to do is really leverage those investments. The public infrastructure investments, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're using those to leverage reinvestment in the community by both people, retail, commercial activities, and dollars. I'm going to talk to you about two cities that have done this, that have been doing this very, very successfully. Memphis is not a name that you associate with livable transportation, but you will. In 2008, Memphis was voted one of the worst cities in the country to walk or bike in, also voted one of the most obese. In 2008, their mayoral regime changed after 26 years. The new mayor that came in said, we're going to do 55 miles of bike facilities within a 3-year period, and we're going to have this. They had 0. They've made it, and they have 200 more on the books. So again, 55 miles in 3 years. Proud to say that they now have that. This is a map of their plan. They started with a crown jewel. They had a rail trail that connected 1,000-acre urban park, Shelby Farms Park, along a rail trail into the Midtown area. So their first initiative was a rail trail. What they found from implementing this was that, number one, they used great materials. It was a great corridor to be able to do this in, and they found that they had a huge latent demand of a cycling community. The place was packed on day one. People were riding this trail while it was still under construction. But that's not quite the end of the road. It actually is the end of the trail as it sits today, because there's about a 2-mile gap between the end of the Green Line on the western side and their signature park, Overton Park. Some of you may know Overton Park from the birthplace of NEPA. But how they're connecting now through there is what they're calling the Overton Broad Connector. They actually are blessed with a situation where they have some very wide roads, very wide right-of-ways, and decline in population. Detroit, take notes. One of the things that has happened here is, and the charge was, how do you do an on-road connector between a signature park, with Overton Park being right here, and the end of their trail, end of their rail trail, and how do you make users feel like they have that they've never left the Green Line? Well, one of the ways that they've looked at doing it is, okay, how do we connect all of these different amenities, and looking at an overall plan of how they do that. They engaged the community. Actually got out and rode bikes. In looking at this corridor, I can tell you it is the only bike ride I've ever had a police escort on, both on bicycles and a cruiser that followed us. So really one of the other points was to really reactivate the neighborhood as well. They do have an emerging arts community here along Broad Avenue, and you may recognize this photo. This was making the rounds on the blogs a little while ago as the Gorilla Road Diet, spelled Gorilla. I think it's actually the other way around, but these merchants in the Arts District actually convinced the city that they could restripe the road with temporary striping. That's the most permanent temporary striping I've ever seen, because 2 years ago is when they did it, and it's still out there today. So we really wanted to take it to the next level and really understand how the trail user, how you could get the trail user to feel like they'd never left the trail, but to be able to experience this district and make that connection. What we came up with was we had 61 feet curb to curb. What we found we could do is meet the travel demands, 1 lane each direction, retain the angle parking along the business side, do a separator that could also be used for parallel parking, and then put in a 12-foot cycle track. So, a city that had 0 miles of bike facilities in 2008 is considering cycle tracks. And that's what it looked like. And very, very popular. We had a very well attended charrette. And today, this project is moving forward. It's moving forward toward implementation, beginning design. The track has actually shifted to the south side of the road at this point, but the cross-section remains basically the same. This project really elevated the awareness in Memphis and their status among bike communities. About 4 weeks ago, Bikes Belong announced 6 cities that they were awarding technical and financial assistance to. Those cities were Austin, Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Memphis. Really a lot of head scratching that went on, but if you saw what was going on here, if you could see what was going on here, you'd understand. And they're not done. They're now looking at beginning design on a 4.5-mile eastern extension of the Green Line to serve the population out east as well, continuing that success with the train station out in that way. They are still doing many, many road diets through resurfacings. And Madison Avenue, any of you that are familiar with that, this was Beale Street before Beale Street. This was the Midtown Entertainment District, Overton Square, very, very popular during the 70s. A lot of excess capacity, and now bringing it back through a program resurfacing project, actually implementing bike lanes, really starting to make that connection all the way from downtown and the river all the way out east to where the eastern population centers are. And if there's any doubt that it's working, these photos were taken in December, 2 weeks after the project were finished. What's that? Chained up outside the business. In 10 minutes, we saw 5 cyclists out on the corridor, and they are patronizing the businesses. And they're not done. One of the most exciting projects is a bi-state connector, looking at taking a 1916 steel truss railroad bridge that actually this was the first vehicular connection between between Memphis and the Arkansas side of the river. Talk about a wild ride. You hung out on the side of the bridge on a cantilever, wooden deck cantilever roadway, and if you had 2 trains running down the middle, I'm sure it was an e-ticket ride. Those of you that are from Florida and remember the early Disney days will know what I'm talking about. But this project is actually rebuilding the wooden deck as a trail facility, as a bike and ped connector between the 2 states. So where is the money coming from? Well, they're accomplishing their road diet projects. They got the big part of their mileage done, the big bang in the first couple of years through ARA, and they're continuing the program resurfacing. Every resurfacing project has to be analyzed to see if there's an opportunity for a road or lane diet to be able to move forward. The Greenline Extension is funded through the Greenline Extension has been funded through CMAQ with a matching city grant. Overton Broad has been 100% private funding to date. They've gotten supplemental technical and financial assistance, and Harahan is actually pursuing a Tiger 4. They have not heard on that yet. But it doesn't have to be a city on the scale of Memphis. It can also be very small towns. Russellville, Arkansas started off with a downtown master plan, and this one is moving at warp speed as well. City engineer, really a believer in complete streets, used the downtown master planning effort to leverage initiatives such as this Main Street initiative. Currently, you see it's a 4-lane undivided roadway. Perfect candidate for a 3-lane conversion to a road diet. That's the ultimate plan. They are actually starting to move forward with a Phase 1 quick victory project. And then the El Paso corridor. Arkansas Tech University here to the north, connecting down to downtown. Significant student body. Roadway targeted for a complete street retrofit as part of the downtown charrette that was conducted in January. Came up with a land use context to provide student housing along there. The section actually fortunate enough to fall into a former state road right-of-way. El Paso was formerly State Road 7. So 60 feet of right-of-way. They could do a cycle track, reallocate the lanes, 10-foot lane widths, add sidewalks. And what's happened here is through the past couple of months working with the city, figured out that by not shifting the center line we were able to really meet their budget. So we've now gone with a one-way cycle track, one lane either side, and then the large rain gardens as separators. So not only are they doing complete streets, they're doing green streets in Russellville, Arkansas. And where's their money coming from? They received a $250,000 AHTD grant for streetscape. They're using that as their quick victory project to actually install the bulb outs on US 64. They also have a dedicated local option sales tax that's passed, and it's hopefully going to be renewed by the voters in November to fund transportation improvements. Their Main Street organization is very, very good and very effective at pursuing and securing grants. They also evaluate every single project, every single resurfacing project for opportunities, and they're looking for their master plan to be able to encourage and leverage priority downtown investments. So some of the benefits, and Kim's going to get into this a little further, there are other dollars out there. So we're doing this to really be able to leverage and realize later phases. Once it's paid for, you know that you want to get the biggest return on investment that you can. So road diets and complete streets inherently increase property values, as do just reductions in speed. Fred, you alluded to that, certainly in downtown West Palm Beach. Also, one of the things that we have seen is one-way to two-way conversions, addition of on-street parking, and streetscaping. Really, those investments in the public realm really start to elevate rents and attract private reinvestment in corridors. So some of the funding sources associated with that, complete streets, all the complete streets things, there's the Surface Transportation Authorization Act that's going to be upcoming, and then continuing with some of the federal programs on the smaller scale, tax increment, business improvement districts, sales tax, still CMAQ and enhancement grants, and then don't forget about private foundations that have these programs. Certainly Bikes Belong is one of those. I want to give you one little word on Tiger. Tiger's not the magic bullet. 20% match will not win a Tiger project. And they do need to be substantially ready, but they are a great source for where homework has been done. You'll see the one on top was a Tiger II recipient in New Haven. A lot of that was funded through public-private partnership. The bottom one is Boundary Street in Beaufort, South Carolina, in which sales tax and TIF money actually funded the match. Both of those had matches in excess of 40%. So some of the key points are that municipalities can partner with other groups, public and private. You can leverage funding and make sure that we form these partnerships, but be very innovative. Mix and match, do as much as you can, make sure that you have the planning done ahead of time. And one key thing is you may not get everything that you ask for initially, but keep asking, because eventually it can happen. So the bottom line, there's not a secret ingredient. It really does take people and very much thought to be able to do these kinds of things. And I thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me ask a question first. I'm not going to come from the engineering and the streetscape and the right-of-way design part angle. I want to talk to you about redevelopment decision-making points and what happens when roads combined with improvements and vertical improvements, what happens to your investment in the district. How many of you all are familiar with what a CRA is, a Community Redevelopment Agency? Okay, so most of you know how CRAs work. What I want to do is talk to you today about really 3 different types of redevelopment projects that took place in this CRA. One of them you probably had an opportunity to look at because it's right across the street, and that's the City Place project. So I'm going to show you 3 different types of deals that took place using right-of-way improvements as the impetus to get that private sector investment. And the reason that that's important is it's one thing to go in and do streetscapes, But when you're going to invest that public money, the question is, what is the rate of return? What's going to happen if you build those roadways, and can you drive that investment? So we'll talk a little bit about a major public-private deal that was City Place. I'll show you a residential deal and how that one was financed, and then going into Northwood Village, which is up at the north end of the city. If you haven't got a chance, you really should pop up there and see that, which is a retail and entertainment district. City Place, I'm not going to get in again too much to the history of it, but many of you may have heard that way back into the 90s, a developer came along and attempted to assemble what is about a 70-acre area. It was very difficult, and the assemblage didn't go well. He ended up going bankrupt. And at the time, you heard Mayor Nancy Graham, who was very pivotal in the development of the city and this project in particular, came in and used eminent domain to complete the rest of that acquisition. Now, the state of Florida no longer has the ability to use eminent domain like this project. So for all practical purposes, this couldn't be repeated. But you see right in the middle of that yellow area, you see that one lone parcel or building. That's the church. That's the Harriet Himmel Church. And again, very interesting that there was, of course, big arguments when the assemblage was going on, and the community came out, said, we've got to keep that. And City Place really was designed around that church, and it ended up being a fantastic asset in the end. You can drive across or walk across, if you can get across Okeechobee. Boy, you're right. Oh, and by the way, the commissioner that took credit for all the great things you did, I guarantee if it would have been a bad streetscape, she would have given you full credit, for sure. City Place is really a true success story. But what was important, and really what the big linchpin was in the beginning, is who's going to build all of the public infrastructure and right-of-way, and how the heck are we going to pay for it? So everything in the right-of-way, including the public plazas, the streets, the sidewalks, and the garages, were funded through a community development district component that had bonding tied to it. So I'll walk you through it, because one of the things that we talked about is giving you a takeaway of, if you have the opportunity to do a very large public-private deal, how can you leverage the future value and future tax value from that private development to help fund what is going to be massive amounts of infrastructure needs. So the CRA had assumed a Sunshine State loan. It was a loan that the state has access to for the remainder of the acquisition of the land. And then through the Community Development District bond, $55 million was issued for the public right-of-way improvements. Now that included the garages, and that was important because at the time they didn't want to charge for parking fees. So they had to make sure that there was enough revenue coming in to fund the repayment on the bonds, not including revenue from parking fees. Then the city did a little bit of $500,000 road work. The bond financing highlights. Very important component of this was making sure that when the CDD was formed, in order to get the banks to loan the money, there had to be a structure that would allow, as the vertical improvements were built, some flexibility that what happens if the property doesn't value out at a high enough rate and produce enough taxes or TIF to pay that bond. And so what you'll see down a few bullets down is that it started out with 3 years of capitalized interest, which is typical in a bond situation. But once the note stabilized at $4.2 million annually, in other words, once there was enough revenue coming in that the tax district would get $4 million, which was the debt service note at a certain point, then number one, the city's covenant would drop off, so it would free up their bonding capacity, and number two, the assessments that the developer had to impose in the beginning would also start to come back. I'll show you a slide a little bit later that might make that a little clearer. So in summary, what the deal was the CRA, through the CDD, issued this $50 million debt, and then they were going to use the increase in value from City Place itself. They were going to use those taxes to repay that debt. They were really only going to use 80% of it because they left a little bit of room. And if you're not confused enough, this should confuse the heck out of you. This is the same thing I just said, only it's in a flow, a waterfall flow of the revenues. So the CDD is the master indenture. That's the place that the money starts from, and that's where it lives. It drops down into a revenue account, and that's how you pay the bondholders. You're paying the debt service from that revenue from the CDD. If there's leftover revenue, it went into a reserve fund, again, just long enough for those assessments to the CDD tenants, which are City Place tenants, and as their assessments went down, the taxes went up, or vice versa. Now, if our taxes went down, and all of a sudden, let's say if it was $4 million in debt service, but we only had $2 million in taxes, City Place tenants had to make up that other $2 million. So the very complex financial structure is what enabled that public-private deal to take place, and this is what ended up happening. In 2001, you can see the blue. In 2001, when the property first came on the tax rolls, it generated about $2 million in TIF. Now remember, the first few years were just interest. So the debt service to pay off all that $50 million was about $2.5 million. The yellow is what City Place had to charge its tenants in order for us to be able to pay the debt service. So we never did have to dig into the reserves. Between the CRA TIF and the assessments, we could make debt service. Then in 2005, you see it was all blue, we were carrying 100% of the debt service. But then the note ballooned because we got past that little window where it was interest only, and assessments kicked back in for the tenants. But that only went on until about a year or so ago, and it probably would have gone on, it would have ended in about '08, but we had our real estate crash. So the CRA tax district revenues didn't go up as high. But what this shows is taxes from $2 million going all the way up to $5, $6, $7 million just from that investment. So not only are we going to be able to pay the debt back, we're going to be able to take in a lot additional tax revenue, again, from the project itself. And that's not even touching on all of the other spin-off that comes from a project this size. It's obviously got a residential component. When you have this many people coming to the area, it's not only a tourist draw, but just a fabulous investment for people to come in and spend money elsewhere when they're in the city. So hopefully you have access to this slideshow, and that may help you later on if you're looking at what are some of the ways that you really can form a true public-private partnership. The second one I'm going to show you, a little bit simpler, is Mary Place. Very blighted area. Usually CRAs are working in blighted neighborhoods, and this one was no exception to that. It was an African-American part of West Palm that was just decimated either through large assemblages that had taken place and or just dilapidated properties. And the Housing Authority had gone in and assembled 8 acres. You can see right in the middle where it's largely vacant. And if you look to the left, you can see that it was still vacant, and on the right you see just big blocks right next to the Intercoastal. So very valuable land, but at the same time very impoverished. The street grid was typical neighborhood, suburban neighborhood area, and the Housing Authority was proposing a development, a low-income tax credit project. Now they had assembled the 8 acres, again using eminent domain, but they found themselves stuck for about 4 years because they couldn't fund the infrastructure. So they had designed, you see how they redesigned the right-of-way. They had designed what is, you know, some consider it a very nice neighborhood pedestrian-oriented streetscape to be able to accommodate this, but they, like I said, couldn't fund it and couldn't finance it. This is our finance plan. I don't know if you can read the numbers, but what we were able to do is do a revenue and use budget and take it to the banks and say, okay, here, same concept again. We are going to issue a bond and we're going to build this streetscape out. And they gave us the $8 million to do that. And we're going to pay for this streetscape, but we're going to use the revenue coming in from this project to help pay that debt service. Now the difference between this and City Place, the numbers still didn't work. They weren't even close to working because that residential development was not going to spin off enough tax increment or any other kind of taxes to pay that debt service. So in this case, the CRA had to use additional revenue and look for additional funds to be able to fund this right-of-way. But what it did is it stabilized stabilize the neighborhood. It was enough to get the neighborhood started that as these developments came in, other housing started up around it. Again, unfortunately, a few years later, victim of our real estate crash here in South Florida. But it really did make a big difference in that neighborhood not deteriorating further. So one of the reasons that our values up in that area have remained relatively stable is because of the investment we made in Mary Place. The last example I'm going to show you is a retail district, very typical of your little neighborhood retail area. It was vibrant at one point some 20, 30 years ago, had really fallen into decline. You can see the top left. Not only planners just cringe when they see this because there's no windows, there's no penetration into the buildings whatsoever. They had boarded them up. They had turned largely into warehouses. The streetscape, it was very similar to some of the other things you've just seen. It was just not a friendly environment for any activity. There was a lot of drug activity, prostitution, etc. So back to when you put on a redevelopment hat and you're looking at this condition, just doing a streetscape won't do it. There's sometimes that public investment alone won't do it. So what we had to do in this particular instance is really make sure that we had a little bit longer term approach to be able to attract private sector investment business by business by business. And that's hard. That's not like having one big city place partner that you get it all figured out and you get the financing no matter how complicated in place and then off you go and build it. This had to contemplate that every one of those little buildings had to be fixed. So we launched, back in the day, we launched a branding campaign that said, "Come grow with us." And you saw the buildings. There was nothing in them, so we couldn't really promise much. And right away, as soon as there was one little business and we found one cute little antique store and one tiny little bagel shop, we started a campaign called Real Places, Real Faces. So we weren't making any fake promises. We were saying that when you come down here, come grow with us and watch what's going to happen, but there are real places to go, and these people have faces, and come down and visit these shops. And then, of course, we'd put on a little event, but just enough to have people stroll around and really make sure that people knew to come down. Well, fast forward, now about 6, 7 years, completely transformed area. There's been about 55 new businesses have opened, over $10 million in investment just in those little stores one at a time. And we got written up in Southern Living magazine last year, and they dubbed it as historically hip. This was in the beginning. We had to create our own landscape. I mean, there was nothing. We brought in trees and tents and anything to create an environment. But it was really just incremental how that streetscape modified the area. There was also the question of on-street parking. At the time, the city had done away with all the parking requirements, so there weren't any. Well, at that point, the city said, "Oh, good, we'll just make it so the cars can go through." And we said, "No, we're going to take this street grid and make sure that wherever there is potential infill development for retailers, we're going to make sure that there's on-street parking." We also bought 3 surface parking lots and made sure that there was adequate parking. And then the green area on the left is a big 5-acre site that we assembled, and we call it the anchor site, because we always said that's the site that we're going to develop into a key anchor tenant that will be a larger draw. And actually that site is ready to go out for development. So that was a combination of funding sources similar to what you heard Wade say, which is just a culmination of either local, state, and federal funds, including state of Florida, putting in through a JPA an agreement that they would invest, and the Metropolitan Planning Organization is a group also that we were able to attach funds from. So in that case, even though we probably could have paid for it ourselves, that program that we put in place enabled us to go after grants and take what was this very poor right-of-way condition and turn it into just a very nice right-of-way that not only is pedestrian-friendly but has that on-street parking. And across the street, a tie to that was making sure that what was a nasty, open, just vacant lot, we just sodded it, put a little paver thing through it, and found a piece of art that the city didn't want anymore, and not call it a park, but just try to clean up enough the public realm. And again, it's not a street, but it was a very important component. Like I said, there's been over 50 new businesses. Many of them have gotten facades and have completely renovated. There's been $10 million plus investment in the area, and now if you go up there, it's really a cool area, just something that you wouldn't find that easy. We have monthly promenades, and those are what draw in new tenants, and at this point the biggest advocates for the area really are the merchants themselves. So those are three different examples of how right-of-way can result in private sector investment. And like I said, if you'd like more information about the nuances of those funding strategies, especially for City Place, you can get that from our agency. So thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity, and would be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Kim, Wade, and Fred. At this time, we'll accept any questions. Since this is being recorded, I'll repeat the question so that everyone can hear it. If anyone has any questions.
Everybody wants to go to City Place.
Everyone wants to go to City Place.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the tax increment financing and how that works. Are you just taking the increased property value of the taxes in the properties that are benefiting from the projects, or is this like a supplementary add-on special tax district kind of arrangement?
No, in the state of Florida, we operate under Chapter 163, so you can go to Florida State Statute 163, Part 3. It's a very defined formula, and basically what it is the city or the municipality or whatever government, it could be a county as well, will pick a geographic area that they want to form a redevelopment district in. And the year that the district is formed, that's called the base year. So the taxes and the tax base of that base year is frozen, and any incremental value in those properties within that district becomes the tax increment formula. It depends what part of Florida you're in, which taxing authorities will contribute. In this particular case, we have the city, the county, and a downtown development authority, but as you know, there's also school boards and water management districts, etc. So throughout the state, it's normally only 2 or 3 taxing districts that end up contributing. So in our case, as those incremental values went up, the portion of the city, county, and the downtown development authority payment went into the CRA's trust fund, and we get 95% of that because 5% is saved for admin. CRAs are under fire right now in the state of Florida because the counties don't like their money being skimmed off the top going into this trust fund for investment. And in California, many of you may have heard, they just shut them down for all practical purposes, but they are all taxing authorities contributed. So they had hundreds of millions of dollars, and there was no funds left for city operations. So if you go through the state statutes, you can see exactly how they're formed, the requirements, and how the trust fund operates.
Great. Any other questions?
How easy was it to redesignate US 1 to a different street? I guess what it used to be on a road guide.
The question is, how easy was it to redesignate US 1, the Dixie Olive split that Fred mentioned? How easy was it to redesignate US 1?
I mentioned that one of the allies in this initiative was the mayor, Nancy Graham. But the other real important person was Rick Chesser, the district secretary for DOT. And I think without his leadership, it would have been a lot harder to do. It ended up being fairly straightforward. The legal documents to accomplish it were a couple pages long. But I'm sure that the department was reacting to their secretary's dictum that this was going to happen. I think in other places it's been harder without that leadership from the top of DOT.
Yeah, Fred, if I can just add on to that a little bit. Doing some work over in Central Florida previously, some of the things, and we also had a sympathetic district secretary over there, but some of the things that we had to deal with that I think were certainly in your favor on Dixie Olive was you did have a facility that met the characteristics of being able to be redesignated. You had the 4-lane roadway over there as well. One of the things that we would always run into was the issue of route continuity. So being able to make that transition to that other facility and then get it back to where it needed to go. Conversely, the state that I'm in currently, in North Carolina, they would love to shed as many lane miles as they could. So they'll be more than happy to give you a road or a piece of a road or a half of a road or whatever. But one of the issues we deal with is most of the roads there are state roads, are under state DOT control. But it's interesting that you brought that up because the whole route continuity thing was one of the things we always had to deal with.
Well, and it was a business transaction too. DOT improved the streets, improved their streets and gave them to the city, and vice versa. The city had to put dollars into quadrille to bring it up to DOT standards. It was in pretty good shape already, so there was very little they had to do. But it was a trade. It was a business transaction.
As a follow-up to that real quick, if Wade and Fred could help me understand, here in Florida I've worked on several road diets and complete street projects, some actually on DOT roads, and instead of changing the designation, we've actually been successful in implementing the complete street on a DOT roadway, and it's actually been very positive and very successful down here. And again, it's mostly in the more urban eastern areas with lesser traffic volumes. What have been your experiences in other places in implementing these on DOT roads instead of just switching them?
Adam, from my perspective, a lot of it depends on your DOT. And working more in more states, it can be very, very different from state to state. A lot of times there are absolute minimums on lane width, and that varies from state to state. Some states will let you go down as low as 10. Some states absolutely will not let you go anything less than an 11. And I'm speaking again from both North and South Carolina, 11-foot lane width was the minimum. One of the things that we have had happen in North Carolina recently was 3 years ago they adopted a complete streets policy. They have just released, I think, the 3rd draft of their design guidelines, and they actually do advocate 10-foot lane widths. But it's all contextually based. So in certain situations, in certain contexts, that is applicable. So pretty much what I found is if you're able to give the engineers something to hang their hat on, whether it's just a fallback to the AASHTO Green Book or any other kind of design guidance, and the CNU ITE manual is a good example of that design guidance as well, that they are much more amenable. It's not to say that there aren't some DOTs out there that are absolutely positively not. Won't mention names, but the world is changing. Fred, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we talk about stakeholders in these kinds of things, and those are the ones that have an interest in the project and work to help you make it happen. But there are also players that have veto power, and I think you need to identify those early on because they can kill a good idea, whether it's the fire chief or the public works guy or whatever. And it really does come down to who's in leadership and who can dictate policy within the agency. I'm going to start calling that the Billy Hadaway factor because he is the new district secretary in District 1, FDOT, which is a place that I would not consider very liberal in terms of being able to accomplish these things, but I think there's a new sheriff in town now, and so if we can get sheriffs like that in other places, we'll be much better off.
Not to put you on the spot, Billy.
Yeah. We're expecting big things, though.
So, couple more questions.
Got a question. It looked like in some of the spots where you did the cycle tracks, you were able to, you actually had, you removed a lane of vehicular traffic. Did that result in any congestion, or were the streets so under capacity that you're able to do that? We tried that in a couple of places in our area and gotten just ridiculous pushback.
Yeah, to address that, Overton Broad was a 5-lane cross-section, and I don't know if you noticed, there was a very large road just to the south of it. That road that was just to the south was actually supposed to have been the continuation of Interstate 40 that was stopped in the 1960s by the NEPA legislation. In their great wisdom, the city went ahead and built it as far as they could without impacting the park. When they opened that in the late 90s, traffic volumes on Broad Avenue went from the 25,000 a day range down to 3,000 a day. So yes, we were really dealing with a lot of excess capacity, and we could really right-size the road. In a lot of situations, Madison Avenue was a little different animal. You saw the road diet on Madison where it went from a 4 to a 3. The interesting thing on the 4-3 was that Madison was carrying about 12,000 vehicles a day. The biggest issue we had there was with the business owners. The business owners could not understand how we would be taking 2 lanes of traffic, be taking half the lanes off of a street, and that they wouldn't lose half their traffic. And finally, whenever we started to get to the discussion of, okay, your road, there's really not much difference in capacity between a 4-lane undivided and a 3-lane. 2 lanes with a turn lane, and that doesn't mean that you're losing half your traffic. Finally, the thing that pretty much sold it there was simulation analysis based on traffic volumes and a growth factor that actually showed a net result of, I think, on the 2 miles of the corridor, less than 20 seconds of increased travel time. That was what actually sold it, because inherently they knew if it doesn't take me any longer to drive it, I'm not going to shift my route. So, but yeah, the capacity, the operations piece is always a big part of it, and we have to be very sensitive to what a road carries and what we can do with it.
Great. There's a question in the back.
In general, I assume everybody might have heard that, but CRAs being in the state they're in, what is the future for CRAs, and if there's other forms of funding in addition to or in place of? CRAs are in a struggle in the state of Florida. We had very, very bad legislation proposed this year, and there's a Florida Redevelopment Association that fights that every year, trying to make the case that these kinds of investments obviously have very strong economic impact. But I think until legislation severs CRA's function, I think CRAs will continue to be the dominant source of revenue of investment in the South Florida area. Now, not every city has a CRA, and for those that don't, or at the point in time that the CRAs are hindered for whatever reason, there's a few things that are actually starting to take hold more often than not. One of them is business improvement districts or some form of special assessment. Even here in West Palm, the South Dixie area, where there's a lot of cute, quaint little antique stores, they don't have a CRA. There's no way the county and we would form one at this point. But we could do a special assessment district down there, even on a small scale, to get some marketing, some promotion, some activity, and maybe even a few right-of-way improvements. So you're starting to see that. Main Street has always been and will always be, I think, a viable organization, because if you have a Main Street, you can apply for additional grants. And then probably the most prevalent is going to be the combination of funding that you saw we did up in the Northwood area, which is the grants through the metropolitan planning organizations. There is the TCA money. There's just general either state, local, or federal grants that even the train station is under construction right now with that money. The Quadrille project has grant money for it. So there really is, if you have an aggressive grant writing system in a city, there is quite a bit of money out there. You just have to be patient and you have to plan for it. So cities do have to get a little more creative and look for the different packages, but CRAs aren't done yet. They should be around still for a while.
Okay. All right, one more question.
Wayne, this is for Wade. You mentioned
In both Memphis and Russellville, it is a directive by elected or appointed officials. In Russellville, it is a directive by the city engineer and public works director that every resurfacing project be reviewed. In Memphis, it is a mayoral directive. The mayor said, "We will do this," and you, as my city engineer, will do this. And the one time that he didn't do that, he was no longer the city engineer. Memphis was a little bit of a different story because it was a city that had had the same administration for 26 years, same mayor, same administration for 26 years. So there was a lot of change that could be accomplished quickly. And was, but it was a mayoral directive, not a voted upon policy, if you will, not in their comp plan. It's just basically the standard procedure, implemented standard procedure from the engineering department and from the mayor's office.
Okay. Well, we're about out of time, so thank you very much. We'll stay around for a while if you have any other questions.